All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 16. As I promised you, we're going to pick up the pace here. Since we're in the last chapter, you know that most of this is Paul summing up the things of this book. So in staying with this lightning speed approach, we're going to get all the way down through verse 2 this morning.
You're in our hopes, Will.
I got your hopes up. Okay, I did not mean to lie. I had the greatest of intentions to get through more material than this. And in my defense, it is not my fault, it's Paul's fault. The guy cannot write anything without teaching. I have found that he will say greetings and there's instruction in it. He can't even pray without putting another sermon on the table for you. So once again, we're going to deal with some things. And in my defense, also, you are deeply fortunate, because we are going to talk about a topic that I know is on the mind of every Christian. The number of people that have come to me and said, Myron, would you teach an entire series on church giving? I cannot count the number of people, especially in this room, who have come up to me and said, I would love to see that happen. Maybe a 10-parter where we can really dig down into this. And the reason I can't count the number of people, because no one has ever asked me, please teach us more on giving in the church. This is that topic that if they know it's coming, you know attendance will be down. And if you look at the empty chairs, some of you read ahead, obviously. It is a topic that people don't like to go to, and I get it. If you grew up like I did as a Southern Baptist, we always had the fundraisers, especially during the summer. There was something that, and you would get remember the thermometer?
Oh, yeah.
They put it on the sign, put that in the front of the church, and you'd watch it as that's the goal, we got to get to this many dollars, and they hit you with that again and again. In my defense, you will never find me teaching on the topic unless it shows up in the text. And unfortunately for you, today, it shows up in the text. I do want you to understand something about what's going on here and why it shows up. Because Paul is doing something here that I want you to follow. If you remember how we ended up our last chapter, remember how we got there? Let me back up here, maybe to verse 54. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, and then shall come to pass a saying that is written, death is swallowed in victory. Oh, death, where is your sting? Oh, death, where is your victory and where is your sting? Remember that image I told you about? What the image is Paul is talking about? This is the boxer in the ring. The opponent is down for the count, and he's standing there, arms raised, in that victorious moment. And Paul goes from this victorious moment and immediately pivots to the next chapter and says, oh, by the way, now concerning the collection. And you have to look at that and go, what's he doing? I mean, you've got him all worked up here. You've taken us to this mountaintop. We have this wonderful experience. And your first thought might be, if you're a smart speaker, the second you've got everybody excited is a good time to get them to slip a few more bucks in the plate. And it has nothing to do with what Paul does here. I want you to understand the setting. Paul has dedicated the entire 15th chapter to one topic. What was that topic? The resurrection. I think so. One of 58 verses, only one of you remembered. 58 verses on the resurrection. Why did he teach about the resurrection? Was it because the Corinthians had nailed this down and had the perfect understanding of this?
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. Look at how, after he says this, O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Note this, the sting of death is sin. The power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. There's the victory part. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable. Immovable in what? Your faith in what is true. Be immovable about what is true. And then he says, and be abundant in your abounding in the work of the Lord. Now I want you to think for a second. Is this an apt description of the Corinthian believers? People who are immovable in their faith and abounding in the work of the Lord.
No, not really.
Not really. Can you think of any people who are less likely to be characterized by those two things? Remember, all 58 verses of chapter 15 were because they had moved. They had given up ground on the topic and the teaching that God had placed before them on the resurrection. They didn't hold fast. Abounding in good works. I want you to understand, Paul is changing this because he says, this is how you should be. This is the excitement you should understand if you had stood fast on this, if you had been abounding in good works. You deserve your moment in the center of the ring, hands raised in victory. Unfortunately, he is now saying as he pivots to verse 1 of the next chapter, that ain't you. You have no business standing there in the middle of the ring because you've done everything but be steadfast and everything but abound in the works of the Lord. Remember what they celebrated? If you go back to chapter 5, there was a moment there. They had a moment of celebration for how good they were doing in the church. Something had happened, and Paul says this, there are things happening among you that the Gentiles are shocked by. Remember what he said it was? A man has his father's wife. And he said, and you are what? Remember what he said about them? You are proud of it. Their moment in the ring is when they go, look at how we are being open-minded about sin. Look at us, tolerant us. And Paul is saying, you've got this about as mixed up as you can be. You have flipped everything upside down. Instead of celebrating steadfastness, you are celebrating your slide into sin. Everything you could do wrong, you have done wrong. And instead of having your moment, I think we need to pivot and talk about something practical. Now, I want you to think about this. If Paul wants to take them back down off of that moment in the ring and say, no, that's not yours yet, can you think of anything more telling than to talk about how a person handles money? This is a topic most of us don't like, but the reality comes down to this. There's probably nothing that is more telling in terms of your discipline and character in life than how we handle money and things. Our hold, our values are told to us more specifically here than perhaps any place else. Now, I want to make something very plain here. The collection Paul is talking about, the general principles will be there. We will talk about the general principles of what giving in the church looks like and why, but the collection that he is specifically talking about here is not the church offering that we normally think of. There's another offering Paul has been collecting for over a year among the Gentile churches. A very specific collection for a very specific purpose. I want to talk about that, and we're going to get into it. But I want to start here by first making some of you understand something. The collection that Paul is talking about comes from a place that has always marked a difference in God's people. Ever since God first started calling a people to himself and set the standards for their generosity and their giving, it has always been, or has always had in those instructions a purpose to help those in need. I want you to understand that for the Jewish believer and for the church, charity has been one of the defining differences between Christian people and God's people and the rest of the world since the very beginning. I want to put a little history to this. As you go back into the Old Testament, as we look at kinds of things there was a recognition about poverty in the world. And I think we have to admit that our notions of poverty in the Western world and how most of the world has experienced poverty are a little different. I know, it's shocking. Well, just to give you one little factor, in America today, the vast majority, over 2/3 of those who we see as being in poverty are overweight. Now, I want to put that as not an attack on anybody as game point. I'm just going to say this. In the rest of the world, that's not a problem. Poverty there is not marked by people with morbid obesity. There's a real difference in how we experience poverty. And any of you ever been to a third world country and gone outside the tourist areas? I know you have, Dave. Poverty is a little different out there in the third world, isn't it? When you see it in the face, it's a different kind of thing. And I want you to understand, Scripture has always structured God's people to be aware of that. There are laws and things that are in there designed to deal with this. Here's one that I've always loved. I looked at this and I looked at some non-Christian theologians. I love how you can be a theologian, theos, God, study of God and not be a Christian. But they have this thing, and they mention signs of the patriarchy in the Old Testament, how evil the patriarchy has been. And here's one of the laws they looked at. Here was the thing that happened. When he marries John, he passes away. You know who's responsibility for when he comes up next?
Brother.
If he has an unmarried brother, the job is for him to marry and raise
The children.
John's children, in John's name. They are never to be really his, they are to be John's children passing through that. And they looked at, see, women are nothing more than chattel. They're just, you just own them. You just pass them on through the family like that. And they look at that and they say, what an evil concept. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Through the entirety of time, now God understood this long before we started doing surveys and did research. Which group of people are most likely to be impoverished throughout time? Single women with children. Far from being an issue of patriarchy, here's what the ancient world, especially God, established. A marriage was not just between two people, but two families and two communities, and everybody took responsibility for that union. And here was the thing, if you don't have a brother who's unmarried who can step into that, the next closest male relative in your family was to take responsibility for you and the children. If there was no male, the next thing they had was there was a temple fund. And if you look at the breakdown of the tithes and offerings of every Jew, part of that went into a fund designed to help those who could not help themselves. And the idea being, we would like you to continue to be a mom rather than do other things, and also the understanding that in the ancient world, your options were somewhat limited. Taking care of the poor, most especially widows and orphans, was a priority God established. They did other things in the ancient world also to try to make provision. And you may think this is rather harsh, but have you read the book of Ruth? Ruth, husband had passed. How did she get food for herself and her family? Gleaning. Gleaning what?
Leftover.
Yeah, fields that were not her own. And here was the law as established. Try this. You own the field. Your guys go through it. And in most cases, after they'd done the first major gleaning, you sent a second crew back through to get the stalks that people had walked down, had not gathered, had missed. But you didn't do that in Israel. Why? For the poor who had access. And they would work through the field and they would find the leftover from the gleanings so that they could eat. You go, well, that's a little harsh. Understand this, they had neither the wealth nor the distribution systems available to us we have now. So they made laws to make provision, to find some way.
Plus they worked to do it. They weren't just given.
There was the other thing. Welfare was designed, and as harsh as it may sound, the ancient world had a law that even carries through into Scripture. And you may have heard this, if a man will not work, he will not eat. Not one who cannot, but will not. Also notice it says a man. There's also some rather harsh comments you find in the New Testament that talk about that. A believer who will not provide for his own family is considered to be what? An infidel. Worse than an unbeliever. He is seen as the lowest kind of animal imaginable. I want you to understand that is from 1 Timothy, I believe, chapter 5. I believe we're verse 8, but that whole thing comes down to this. It is the place from which we get an old adage you may have heard in English. And it's one that we have talked about. Charity begins at home. You take care of your own. You establish a character there first, and you try to get that done right. And this became a standard, basic rules. The Greeks and Romans even had provision for this. And the temple had people who passed out and tried to help it, but the simple reality was most often the resources were less than the need. This was a constant problem in the ancient world, especially when you had setbacks and famines and things that happened, and there were problems that happened there. When Paul was commissioned into the ministry, James, the brother of Jesus, not James the apostle, he was dead by that time, John and Peter met with him, first off saying, we want you to get out of Jerusalem as quickly as possible, because you're not terribly popular here. Why don't you be ministering someplace else? And we all know why that was. Paul didn't have the greatest reputation among the early Jewish church, but they sent him out with this commission: make sure you take care of the poor. This Old Testament adage carried into the church, and if you know anything about church history, nearly every welfare program we have in the West did not begin as a government program. It was the church that established hospitals, as a church that established orphanages, as a church that established schools, as a church that had widows programs, and all these things. And I will say this, I think maybe the biggest mistake we ever made was letting the government take over those programs for us.
Why? Because they manage things so well.
And it's not just because of the waste, and you're right. We look at that, and from what I've seen in most welfare programs, for every dollar collected for welfare, only about 17 cents is actually spent on the people with a need. The rest is eaten up by bureaucracy. So one, it's inefficient, but two is this next thing. The church and the early Jewish understanding was this: you were supposed to be involved directly with a person in need. There is a connection that is made when you come alongside someone personally, when you enter their home and bring food, when you sit down and talk about what is the issue at hand, what has caused you to be in this situation. You became part of a solution rather than just writing a check. This was a big deal in how the early church functioned. In the case here, it turns out that, as Paul was told, the beginning point was to collect for the needy, and the first needy you took care of were those in the church. That's because we didn't care about the unsaved at all. Christianity has always said those people don't matter to us, right? No. Okay, that's not what it said. Why would it start by meeting the needs of the people in the church?
They're your family.
It's the home.
Again, you start with the discipline to look after your own. Yes?
It's also a testimony to watching world.
There again, our love for one another. We see that establishment. It draws them to us. It is supposed to be establishing that character there, and understand this, unless you show that character, it is unlikely that you're going to have real character when it comes to the rest of the needy. Why is it that we have as our elders? We say that you have to manage your own household well, and you have to have children who are believers. How many of you have known, seen, or even served alongside a pastor who cared for everybody else's needs but never seemed to have time for his wife and his own children? How many of those cases have you come across? And if you've been around a little longer than you have, man, you meet a few. I have seen men that will do this. They're involved with Big Brothers, and they are in the scouting program, and they have time for everybody's son but their own. And these are issues that come up. People fail in these categories, and you have to establish the character at home first, and you have to establish credibility there first. And so the beginning point always had that going on. And as it turns out, there was a group of Christians in the world that were the poorest, the worst off of any Christians in the world. Shot at who those were. Jews in Jerusalem especially. These people were struggling. Now, why? Why are they having a hard time?
Cut off from all the guilds, in a manner of speaking.
Yeah, here's
They
what
were
we-
kicked out of the synagogue, so they didn't have any problem.
There's what's starting to go on. There's several things going on. First off, Jerusalem itself is no longer a rich city. This is not Solomon's city. This is not David's city anymore. Jerusalem is a backwater in the Roman Empire. It is not a major trip. It is not a wealthy city. And it's also not a wealthy city because Romans have to keep an inordinate number of troops in Israel. You know why they had to keep an inordinate number of troops in Israel?
Hardened necks.
Stiff-necked people. There were two places in the world that cost Rome more than any place else: Britain and Israel. Because the people would never settle down. And Rome had this basic policy: if I have to put troops here, guess who's paying for them?
Lower taxes, will go up.
And we will raise taxes and make sure you pay every dime for us to occupy and compel you to do what we say. And so Israel paid a lot of money in taxes, more than most places. There was also this for the Christians, and that's what you had mentioned. Tens of thousands of Christians tens of thousands of people had become Christians in Jerusalem. The Jews were worried that the population might tip in favor of Christians. They were growing so fast. And they wanted to put this under control, and so they passed some laws. Christians could not sell their goods or their crops or anything in the city marketplaces. They were shut off from these things. The guilds would not allow you to work for them if you were a Christian. It was common for Jewish families to hold funerals if their son or daughter became a Christian. They were now dead, which that under their law meant they no longer had to care for them. So forget those laws about if your husband dies or if you need help, because you're dead. We don't care what happens to you, and we're not about to start. Issues got very bad. And then if things weren't bad enough then, a famine hit Jerusalem during the time that Paul is writing this letter. For about 4 years, the whole place is suffering. And if there's only so much to go around, how do you think the Jews handle distribution? Just to the Jews.
Yeah.
Very poorly, because they would only do it to a certain part of the population. So you have people that are really suffering. What did the church try to do about it? You might remember some of that in Acts. The first thing they did is, we are now going to hold all things in common. Now, I have gotten so tired of theologians that have come here and looked at that and said, there it is. Obviously, a socialistic, communistic system is what God had in mind, the early church, and I've had cult group after cult group put that out there and say, here's what we need to do. It's right there in Acts. Let's take everything you have, you give it to me as your cult leader, and I'll take care of you out of all these proceeds.
We'll feed you Kool-Aid.
And,
That's what I was thinking.
and amazingly, as it turns out, the only person that seems to have plenty of everything is the cult leader. That had nothing to do with what was going on. They had no choice but to pool their resources. As a matter of fact, Barnabas started another tradition, and Barnabas said this: I have this section of land, I'll sell it, and we'll give that to the church so that we can at least try to feed these people. Now, if you know anything about this, how many times can you sell a piece of land and get money for it? Once. Once the money is gone, now what do you do? That's another thing the socialists have never quite figured. We're going to take all the means of production and turn it over to the people, take all the wealth. You can do that once. And then when there's nobody making wealth anymore, guess what happens? But here we are. The church now is in that situation. They're running out of land to sell. And this is one of my little favorites from history, just as an aside. Doesn't have a lot to do with the text, but you just find this interesting. Who bought the land? Christian comes up, John, you got to sell this piece of land. You're dead. We've declared you dead because you became a Christian, but you're going to sell the land. And you know what happens? That God declared you dead? I buy the land because I know you're desperate, which means
Lesser of a price.
I'm going to get a price that is hard to beat. So for today, until you sign this, you're alive. As soon as you're done, you're dead again. But I'm going to let you bring you back from the grave just long enough to sign the contract, and we're going to deal with that. So here is Israel, here is Jerusalem, and they are starving. And Paul has to set up this fund. He's been collecting among the Macedonian Galatian churches for a year, and he has been telling them, until there's enough money to make it worth my while, I ain't going to Jerusalem until you are generous enough for me to take a sum that's big enough to make a difference. Now, Paul, never missing an opportunity, also decided there was an opportunity in this to do something. And he had said this, he had been teaching this to the Gentile churches. He said this: you need to understand something. You actually owe a debt to those Jews in Jerusalem. Because Paul knew something. Despite the fact that Jesus had come along and broken down the dividing wall, and now there was neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor slave nor free, they were all one in Christ. Did the church live that way? No, not so well. The Jews still tended to dislike the Gentiles, and the Gentiles, being wonderful, better people than the Jews, hated them right back. That's how it worked. And Paul saw an opportunity. So he told the Gentiles this: you owe a debt to the Jews, because in case you hadn't noticed, that Messiah, that Jesus Christ guy, happened to be Jewish. Me, the Apostle Paul, and in fact, all of the apostles that have come out and shared this gospel with you, that you now hold and have the salvation, you know who all those guys were? They were Jews. So as it turns out, God has used the Jews to bring salvation to the Gentiles. Maybe a little love back would be a nice thing to try. Maybe if you had a little lesser of an attitude about this whole thing and recognized there's a debt to pay here. Not only that, he would tell them, and the people who are suffering the worst for their faith in Christ at this point in time in the empire are the Jewish believers. And so he was giving them a sense of debt. He also understood this: if he took the money to the Jews, who hated the Gentiles but needed the money, there might be a little more of an open heart to say, yeah, I guess we can break down that dividing wall because I'd like to eat. So he recognized he could get the Jews to start warming up to things. Because have you ever had an opportunity to help somebody in a point of need? You personally, I mean, you didn't turn it over to the church, you didn't come to the deacon's fund, but you had a chance to put something in someone's hand, to fix a problem, to do something for them that just between you. Did you ever notice what it did to the relationship? There's a change there, isn't there? When you can step into someone's life. My wife and I, a number of years ago, fairly early in our marriage, decided to set up what we called an emergency fund. Now, originally, the emergency fund was for this. We tried to do a discipline that said, we're going to put a certain amount of money aside until we get this much money in the bank, and we set a goal for it. And then we're going to set this in a separate place and pretend it doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. It's not part of the budget. It has nothing. And it only happens when it's an emergency. And so when a bad thing happened and you had to have cash, there it was. And then the discipline was, until you paid it back, you didn't buy anything else. You didn't do anything else until the money was put back in there. What we found is that gave us some freedom if we decided that it wasn't just for our emergencies. And so over the years, we grew that amount to a size that we felt would be useful for someone in need. And we set aside this opportunity. If someone's need was there and we could meet it, we could go here and be ready to meet a need. Now, over the time, we've had several opportunities to do some things, and the change it made is worth the investment, I'll tell you. We had a situation at my wife's work. Some paychecks didn't come through. There was a mistake made on the office side. And there was one of the instructors there is going, I can't wait for the state said, we'll have new checks in about 30 days. And she's going, my house note isn't waiting 30 days. My bills, I have to have cash now. And there was a lot of friction between her and my wife. She was not a happy person. And we were able to go and say, we'll cover you your month. We were able to go and just hand her paycheck in cash. You will not believe the distinction as someone who was never fond of Christians, that was never really fond of my wife. The attitude change was unimaginable. That someone, she had never had anyone in her life offer her something and tell her, if you can't pay it back, don't worry. Her brother remarried and his wife lost her child, and they came out to California and could not pay for a funeral. And you just know the ability to be able to go, I can take care of that. It changes relationships, and it changes you when you become part of not just writing a check, but personally interacting with people in need. And Paul is trying to get the Gentiles to interact and become part of what is happening in Israel and become close with these people and touch their lives in a very real way. In fact, he takes a group of Gentiles with him when he takes the money there. just to make that connection. It makes a difference. Now, with all that background, also put this in, Paul is also answering questions. If you remember when I started this book, I told you Paul got a letter with a series of questions that they wanted to understand. And it appears that one of them might be, how does the church handle this aspect of giving? And Paul is going to deal with that. Now, you kind of wonder, why did the early church give? Because they weren't like us. They didn't have properties. They didn't have the kind of bills we have. What would the early church be collecting money to do? Ministry. They sent missionaries. They paid for people in the field. They did have full-time staff that they took care of. And they tried to compensate the people who offered their homes regularly for the church to meet. Because I don't know if you've had a lot of people in your home. I know you guys have big groups. Isn't there a bit of a mess and cost in cleaning up after everybody leaves? That's a reality. So the church established that we are going to collect money to support ministry. Now I want you to look at these two verses here, and that's as far as we're going to get today, just to give you a sense of this, and two critical things to understand why the collection was taken. Notice what Paul says. Now concerning the collection, and what is the collection for? For the saints. I want you to start to understand something here. We've lost a little sight of that once the church owned properties and had bills to pay. Oftentimes we lose sight of this, and people are saying, well, you know, we got to keep the electric bill paid, we got to pay the house, we got to pay the property cost and all these other things, and we need you to give so we can take care of the property. We've lost sight of something. Why did the church ever get the property, and what was it supposed to be for? Ministry to the saints. When you lose sight of that and you flip it upside down and you're just supporting the bills on a piece of land, you have missed the point. What is supposed to happen here? Ministry to the saints. Why do we get a place set aside? So that our children had a safe place to come, to get taught, to interact, to make friends, to enjoy themselves. There was a whole series of things that happened so that ministry can happen. When a building loses that purpose, when a building is just an edifice you are supporting, and it is no longer about using it down to the last ounce and square foot to do ministry, you've lost sight of what we're about. We support ministry. It is for the saints. It is always supposed to have been about being for the saints. Any number of places and things we could do, but we pay for the saints. We deal with those things. Sometimes we set up Christian schools on church property so that we can have any Christian instruction. Whatever we do, though, it's supposed to be for the saints. And Paul makes a big deal about one thing. One of the things the church should do is to free up men to minister to people by paying for their salaries. I've told you before, the first shocker I got in my life that made me ashamed to be a Christian is when I took over a Christian school for a time and found out what we pay teachers. I was stunned as I looked at that salary and Southern California living costs and said, how do they do that? How do they do that? I was amazed by that. And I also have now been on things where I've seen pastors' salaries and stuff. And it amazes me at times what we expect people to do. We are supposed to be about taking care of the saints. Paul even made a whole thing about it. Remember Paul saying, do I not have the right to take a wife with me? Do I not have a right to eat and drink just like you did? And remember what Paul said? I'm not going to demand that right. I'm going to work 2 full-time jobs because frankly you're not mature enough to deal with this. But I love one example he put out there. He said, let me just ask you this. Does a soldier pay his own way to the battlefield? Have you ever known that? We were attacked at Pearl Harbor. Did anybody remember reading about all the communities having bake sales? We're trying to get enough money to send our soldiers overseas to war. You take care of that. Paul even went into this. He says that you don't muzzle the ox. Remember that one? If they're doing the treading, why don't you let them eat a little bit along the way? And then my favorite, and if you have a man who is especially adept at teaching and one that is especially effective in leadership, you should give him double honor. And you know what the text is talking about there? It's not saying, let's have an appreciation luncheon for the pastor. It's double honor means you give him more money. I have a little thing I've noticed in life. There is a connection between pay and performance. Put this out, I'm not saying you should be greedy, but when people get rewarded, when people notice and say, we really appreciate an effort, that means something. Here's the first thing that happened in my work at college when the union shop came into California. The union shop, the first thing they said was, we are going to end merit raises. This was the first negotiated thing. Well, the second. The first was, we're all going to have to pay union dues whether you join the union or not. But second was, merit raises are gone. And they said this, you and I have the same position. You are classified this way, I am classified this way, and no matter how little you work or how much I might work, you both get the same amount. I want to ask you something. Has anybody heard about the work ethics of state workers and heard some negative comments about that? I know, it's strange, but as it turns out, we had a bad reputation for being productive. And I will say this, unless you had a value that said you were doing something more important than yourself, that you weren't just serving the state of California, guess what happens to work ethics if the work tells you, I will pay you the same amount whether you produce a lot or the bare minimum? Which do you think most people are going to do? Bare minimum.
Work ethic.
Work ethic tanked. Just tanked.
And new people who come on a job, they take you aside and go, you're making us look bad. Slow down.
It is funny you said that. The union rep actually called me into a meeting and told me that exact thing. Stop doing that. That's not in your job description. That's not how it works. And you're making the other people in your classification look bad.
Because they are.
And I go, but, and then we had a talk about the merit raises, and I went on about this thing, and I made a comment to him. I go, you know, why shouldn't a person get rewarded for extra and harder work? And he had the most interesting philosophy. Well, you and I might be the same classification, but this is as good as I can get. And why should you get more just because you have better capability?
You just said it.
Because I have better, I don't know if, I would like to see that philosophy applied to the NFL, the NBA. But anyway, I'm getting off track here, but I'm just saying that rewarding someone, taking care of someone, there's an attitude in us that we're supposed to take care of our own, and we're supposed to recognize effort by those that deserve to be recognized. And Paul puts that out there. We're serving the saints. We're not serving a debt, we're serving the saints. And so he says, as I directed the churches of Galatia, you also do. And here's how he says to do it. We're going to end on this one. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. Now that's an interesting one. Paul is saying, I want you to plan weekly for what you're going to do with God. Now why was it on the first day of the week?
That's when they met.
That's when they met. The church met on the first day of the week. Why did the church meet on the first day of the week? That's not the Sabbath. Well, why is it the Lord's Day?
Resurrection.
Yeah, if Jesus said, get up and go to church, you could certainly get your tail out of bed and get on a Sunday morning. Come on now. And he had to move a rock to do it, okay? And you lazy bumps can't make an 8 o'clock service. You look at this thing, it was on the first day of the week. In fact, Paul made a big thing of don't let no one hit you about Sabbath days and festivals. Don't let them to you, because the church worshiped on the day that Jesus rose. Kind of makes sense, because it wasn't at the day that changed everything for us. So they met that day. So Paul is saying, here's an absolute law for every Christian. You better have something on the plate every Sunday morning, or you're in sin. No, that's not what he's saying. Some of you get paid monthly, some of you twice a month. And understand, Paul is avoiding laws. There is no law. He is saying, here's a pattern that is good for discipline. And why is it good discipline to do weekly things?
Keeps you in a good relationship with the Lord.
There's one, I stay focused on what I'm doing.
It's easier to manage.
It's also easier to manage. There's a discipline and a control over things. And here's something that I want to put out to you. As I said when I began this, one of the things that will tell you more about your character than anything else is how you handle money. Now, coming back to what Paul said, remember, it's those who are steadfast, those who are abounding in good works. If you have that attitude, it should change how you view money. And here's the other thing about it. There's a discipline in handling finances that you should be on top of what you're doing with your money. And that shouldn't be put off to just once in a while. That should be a regular thing. And here's something that Paul is saying. You know what's changed from the Old Testament to the New? And I grew up Southern Baptist. We were always told tithes and offerings. 10% was a law. I preached a sermon in the Southern Baptist Church where I said the Old Testament law has no bearing on the New Testament. You will not believe the flash I got back on that one. You say there's no tithes?
You pot stirrer.
Oh, yeah. But here's the distinction. In the New Testament, God says you're not responsible to give me 10%. I'm holding you responsible for how you use all of it. I want you to be evaluating the decisions you make. I do not want you to be a frivolous people doing silly things. Does that mean God never wants you to have nice things, never wants you to own a home, never? No. But he wants you to actually stop and think about what you're doing with your money and make decisions that make sense. Can you imagine how much more on top of our finances we would be if we actually stopped and thought about what we're doing on a regular basis? If you actually ask the question, is this a good choice? Is this something I should do or not? And Paul is establishing, he's coming down to this. I don't want you collecting all the money when I get there. I don't want you to wait to have your life and your walk with God under control until I show up and go, oh, here's a big check, Paul. I don't need a Christian who's only a Christian when I show up. I want a people that is disciplined in thinking, what am I doing with the resources God gave me? How am I using them? And how am I making my decisions? This is what he's after here. Far from being a lesson here today about how you better be putting a check in that plate every week because we got bills to pay, and by golly, you are a terrible people for not supporting us to the love we want. We got a building program and we're dollars short. What's going on with you? Don't make me make a thermometer. You don't want me to go there. No.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It kind of sounds like you are, I feel guilty when I pass the plate by and I
Yeah.
don't put any in because I don't do it every week.
Right, me too.
I do it faithfully on the month. It kind of sounds like you're saying that it's better, other people putting it in every week is better than my putting it in every month. Is that
And that's what
not?
I'm trying not to say. And I think I've missed that because I think it is not a rule that Paul said you better have a check every week. He's saying you should be doing an assessment of what you're doing with God's money on a regular basis.
Regular, yeah.
And if you guys have set a tone that says we're gonna put it once a month, you get paid once a month, or at the end of the month is when you do that, that's fine. All he's asking about is the decision process. Did you stop and think about what you're doing before you decided about that check at the end of the month? We need a people who are disciplined about how we're handling life. And Paul is focusing here on the character of life, not the amount of money in the plate. What are you doing between you and God? How are you thinking about this? What are your husband and you praying about? What are your considerations? What goals and plans are you making to abound in the ministry of Christ? If this is the most important thing of your life, does it touch your decision process? So no, you're not a better Christian if you put a one every week, or if you put one once a week, or once a month, or what. That's not the point. The point is, are you assessing your handling of God's resources in your life and making wise choices with them? Does that answer your question, I hope?
Sort of.
Okay, sort of. Let me just put it that way. It comes down to that. But no, it doesn't mean once every week you've got to put a check in, or God's going, they missed again.
But if we.
Boy, they're going to regret that. No, that's not what's happening.
But if we've decided how much we want to put in,
Yeah.
then it's our business to handle the rest of it.
Absolutely it is. Just don't pull an Ananias fire on me and tell you that you said this and then you do that
Or
instead.
tell us-
That's all.
Or tell us we can't make it that month
There-
because it's our problem to make it.
And you remember that whole speech. He goes, wasn't it your money to begin with? You could have kept it all. You could have given it all. But why did you come in and lie to God? It wasn't about whether they gave or not. It was the attitude of the money and what they were trying to accomplish. And if you have to put one in each week so everybody sees, look, I'm making the contribution. I want everyone to notice, this is the envelope, there's stuff in it. I'm not telling you how much, but there's money in here. If it's that, I'd rather you didn't put a dime in.
That's how you get your pew with your name in it,
Yes. That
So
has
they
been
rip
my
out the
great
pews
thing
and
ever
put
since
chairs.
growing up in Baptist, is to have a pew with my name on it, into eternity. That's, yeah.
I'm sorry, I was sitting in my.
Or a tile on the fountain, donated by, yes.
George, yeah.
Yeah, George.
But money is God's, not ours.
And that's the attitude he wants you to get. How am I using the money God has put into my life? Am I being honest about what I'm doing and making wise decisions? This is never trying to force you to fill up that thermometer. This is not telling you it better be 10% or you're in sin. It isn't telling you it has to be every Sunday you're in sin. Paul is merely asking you, have you gotten control of your life till you know why you're making the decisions that you are? Do you have the kind of character that stops and thinks before you do things? And that's all he's trying to establish. And when you look at the amount of credit card debt, when you look at where most people are, do you think it's a bad piece of advice to say, why don't you have some control over how you spend? Maybe you should think about these things before you do it.
I will say, we had to be careful with our kids because we would, do automatic deposit stuff. And one time we were all sitting together in church and I just thought, my kids never see me put anything in the plate. And so on Sunday, after we ate one time, I'm like, I just want to let you guys all know that this is the way we do it, that we do give. And Clint and Melody were both, whoa, we always thought like, okay, well, I'm putting something in. Well, I'm putting something in. I mean, they just thought we never gave, I guess. But it was interesting that, they had that perception. So you got to be careful when
Well, that's what I
you're
was saying.
training your kids up.
It's like a good example for the children and youth.
Yeah, it is.
To see us putting money in instead of like, no, we're not.
And even a better example is having that discussion at home and letting your kids see how you made the decisions about what you're going to give and when. Before you ever get to the offering plate, to let them see your mother and I stopped and thought about this, and here's what we're going to do and why. And we have a vacation plan for the family, and we have things we're going to do, but we have made sure that in all of those plans, God is on the docket, and we have made decisions about what we're doing there. That's all Paul's after here. Get past all of the rules you've heard and all of the guilt that people want to lay on you about how you give and when, and just stop and ask yourself, am I thinking about and planning wisely what I do, what I spend, and why? Because I'll tell you this, those gifts I told you about that we made to people out of our emergency fund, we didn't get any tax credit for that because we didn't cycle it through the church. And on some of those times, we gave less that month to the church because we put some money back into the emergency fund. And I don't think God is going to hold me accountable as being evil for not cycling it through Faith Community Church.
Oh, bring everything in.
There you go.
Brian,
Yes, sir.
The reality of it all, that was an agrarian society also. It wasn't all shekels.
Nope.
And they were seasonal giving. And we turned our culture, I've been through 2 bankruptcies with churches. Both cases were bad management, stupid.
Bad decision making, yeah.
Not here, but the elders were idiots.
Yeah, we've only gone through, how many, no, we have not ever had at this
The
church.
point being made, we've talked about this before, we live in this 501c world, and then supposedly here in the Antelope Valley, there's like 130 some churches. The reason we don't function as well as the Mormons do and stuff is we are totally fragmented where we waste all this money on all this overhead and everything to go take care of the body. And you gotta really question the Western church structure we have. Do you really wanna give money to something that isn't biblical? This is not a biblical structure we live in. Christ wouldn't have 501c's.
I understand all that, and I also understand that we live in the culture we have, and we have to accommodate certain things as long as it's not trusted and forbidden by Scripture. You and I can have a separate debate about whether or not there should be a 501c and some other things, but I will agree with this. I think we have become a culture that's far more involved with what we're paying for in property than what we're paying for in ministry.
But it's just not that.
We have got to get a distinction in that. Like I said, I just want to get too far gone.
You gotta manage according to the scriptures. You
Madam?
keep saying the same manage
Madam?
according to the world.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir. George, I know you have to go,
Thank you.
and they have to go get some things, greeters and so forth. Let's close down here. Any class questions or comments before we get done?
We hit the
One, I don't have to debate for
Yeah.
20 minutes.